Welcome to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters, a forum of various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of websites. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, a senior fellow at the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by Paul Moreno, who has written one of the response essays for our December 2020 forum on A.V. Dicey. If you'd like to watch any of the other interviews by the authors for this forum or any of the other interviews in this series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself on the Online Library of Liberty is also available on our YouTube channel. Paul Moreno is the William and Berniece Grewcock Chair in Constitutional History at Hillsdale College. He's also the Director of Academic Programs at Hillsdale's Kirby Center. He received his Ph.D. at the University of Maryland and has held visiting professorships at Princeton and the University of Paris School of Law. He's the author of From Direct Action to Affirmative Action, Fair Employment, Law, and Policy in America, 1933 to 1972, and Black Americans in Organized Labor, A New History. He's currently working on a book on the constitutional revolution of the New Deal, and he's published articles in the Journal of Southern History, Independent Review, Journal of Policy History, and Academic Questions. Paul, welcome to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here.
I have to say, I speaking as someone who I don't know a whole lot about Dicey, didn't know a whole lot about Dicey before this forum and his impact on both on the concept of rule of law, although I know a little bit about that, but also your take on this with regards to the impact on administrative law. And I think it's been a really, really very enlightening forum. I wanted to start off by asking you to elaborate a little bit on the distinctions that you make in your forum, or at least that you raise in your forum, about the way that the administrative exceptions to the rule of law emerged in the United Kingdom versus the way they emerged in the United States. And I know you've written quite a bit about how those things emerged in the US. Can you talk a little bit about the history of how that emerged and how it's different than the way it was in the UK, where Dicey taught and did most of his work?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the United States and Great Britain, because of their common law background, were seen as outliers compared to the continent. The administrative state developed earlier and more deeply, especially in France and Prussia, when Prussia into Germany. And Dicey published his book at exactly the same moment, I think the same year as Woodrow Wilson's 1885 doctoral dissertation and his famous essay on the study of administration. So it really is, you had sort of two opposite takes on this. One, this Englishman, sort of aware of the dangers of the administrative state. And then this American, Woodrow Wilson, who was very much an Anglophile and admired the British Constitution, is really calling for the end of it. So it's really sort of wonderfully ironic. And Britain was ahead of the United States in this. And Dicey's, for instance, his account in a later edition of the book about what I focused on was the Trades Disputes Act of 1906, the beginning of the Labour Party in England, a great sort of constitutional crisis that they went through at exactly the moment that Woodrow Wilson is entering politics. And the United States followed suit, but really not until another generation had to pass by for the New Deal to sort of bring to the United States the kind of administrative apparatus that was developing, although in a very different way, in Great Britain.
So you draw the distinct, you sort of draw the lines from the Trade Disputes Act to the Wagner Act. Is there a sort of explicit history and a sort of explicit set of precedents that set that Wagner Act was based on, or were there some differences in the way those two things were implemented?
Yeah, and I think because of the British tradition of parliamentary supremacy, and that was really what Dicey's book was all about, that the king and parliament is sovereign. Although, as he explains, the voters ultimately control who gets into parliament. And parliament, the House of Commons especially, establishing itself as the real power when they get the king to threaten to pack the House of Lords, in a way similar to what FDR tries in 1937. The Labour Party comes into its own. And that was the big difference in that in the United States, we had, for the labor question, the Democratic Party by 1908 had become the ally of organized labor. The American unions were very sort of careful about how much they wanted to get into bed with any particular party. Whereas in England, the labor unions just became the Labour Party and were able to look out for the interests of labor and pass labor legislation through the party in Parliament. So that's another interesting thing too, is that in Britain you had a stronger party system. One of the things that the progressives like Wilson in America were trying to do is weaken the traditional party management of American government in the legislature. So they're sort of cousins with politically with very different constitutional structures that I think shaped the different paths of development. They're headed in the same direction with an empowered bureaucratic state and labor unions by the middle of the 20th century being the most powerful interest group in both countries. But it's very interesting the way the different constitutional forms and institutions shaped their parallel developments.
Can you speculate a little bit? So, I mean, the UK and the United States both are first past the post systems. They're both, the UK is not exclusively a two-party system like the US is, almost exclusively. But you mentioned that the labor unions sort of decided not to participate primarily in one party or the other, although that's certainly changed over the years. But so can you sort of elaborate a little bit on how the position of labor, was it a conscious decision in the UK for labor unions to ally with one party? Was it a conscious decision by labor unions to sort of hedge their bets a little bit in the United States?
Yeah, as I referred to Samuel Gompers and his observing that, well, in England, it's a class-based society. They're quite comfortable with interest groups legislating privileges for themselves because that's part of the way they've been doing things for centuries. Whereas America, because of its egalitarian, Republican, small r, Republican past, you really couldn't come out and overtly say that that's what we're doing, that we're rent seeking, that we're seeking legal privileges.
Right.
And so Gompers would say, all we want is for the state, the government to leave us alone. And we will reward our friends and punish our enemies in either party, not going to align with one or the other. As late as the 1930s, John L. Lewis, who was the head of the more militant Congress of Industrial Organizations, was nominally a Republican. Their Republican legislation in the 1920s really, in a way, sort of presaged and paved the way for the Wagner Act. So because of that basic feature of, we're not a class-based society, class legislation still had a kind of bad odor to it in America. American labor had to approach this question a little more deferentially, a little more sensitive to just the overt kind of political advantages they were seeking. Now, to some degree, the Great Depression, the great crisis of the Great Depression, put that in abeyance. And the Wagner Act really was an extraordinary piece of legislation. One story goes, and I have good reason to believe it, is that it passed overwhelmingly in both houses of Congress. A very radical piece of legislation by a voice vote in the House. It wasn't even a recorded vote. The assumption was that members of Congress knew that the Supreme Court was going to strike this down. And that way they could vote for it and tell labor unions that they were doing them a favor and have the court make sure that we didn't have to live with this legislation. Then, to everyone's surprise, the court upholds it and we're stuck with it. And for about 12 years later in the Taft-Hartley Act, we're able to curb some of its abuses. So that, too, is another peculiarity of our system, in that we have the powerful Supreme Court that also has a sort of veto power in the American constitutional system. And you didn't have that in England, at least until recently. Now they have a Supreme Court, and it's trying to get in, sort of imitate its American predecessor.
So I wanted to raise two things you just said. The first one was that you referred to the act as rent seeking, and I'm glad you did that, because when I had a chance to speak to Judge Glock, the lead author, last week, I mentioned that the Trade Disputes Act looked a lot like rent seeking to me, as someone who's got a more of a political economy background, because of that distinction that's carved out as a result of it. But it's interesting, because if you think about it from from the perspective of rent seeking, then all of a sudden you have to sort of consider, as you just said, this distinction of where the courts lie, right? So, I mean, in the U.S. system, it's distinctly different. And another thing that I wanted to sort of explore was this notion, and you raised it, about how Dicey sees Parliament as sort of the dominant player, and he was skeptical, as I understand it, of the whole separation of powers idea, at least initially in his work. How do you think that plays out for the way we have to read Dicey today and his understanding of the English versus the American systems.
Yeah, because he called the Trade Disputes Act, it was legalizing illegality, that it was giving unions privileges so that they could commit crimes and torts and not be punished for it. And it's interesting the way the U.S. Congress dealt with the courts before the Wagner Act in the 1932 Norris-LaGuardia Act. The Congress actually very rarely have they done this, but they do. Congress has the power under Article 3 to limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It almost never uses it, but this is one occasion where it did, where it said that federal courts could not issue injunctions in labor disputes. And that was all that the AFL claimed that they wanted as of 1932. That would change when the Great Depression set in. But there you had sort of a British-style expression of congressional supremacy, very rare use of the exceptions clause in Article 3 of the Constitution. So because FDR then took on the court in 1937 in a very ham-handed, politically unastute way, the court ended up surviving this conflict with the president and the Congress. But if FDR had played his cards differently, we might have had in America more of a British-style system without checks and balances, without the separation of powers. In fact, Roosevelt was quite overt in saying that he wanted the court not just to go along with what Congress and the president were doing, but to contribute to it. The metaphor that he used was that the Congress and the president and the Supreme Court were a three-horse team, and the Supreme Court was not pulling with the other two horses. And that's a British style, sort of Dicey-esque view that what you want is to have effective government. You can't have too much checks and balances, separation of powers.
Well, because sovereignty is the Parliament is sovereign, correct? Right. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that's another. In fact, this goes back to the essence of the American Revolution. That the British, by the late 18th century, were comfortable with this idea of sovereignty, that political science concept of there being some ultimate, irresponsible, Blackstone called it despotic power in any polity. And that's what the Americans rebelled against. And a large part of our constitutional system was an attempt to sort of put that question of sovereignty aside. We say that it resides in the people, but not in a particular institution of government. And many people who have their doubts about the American system and American constitutionalism say that, well, it's impossible. That's a logical contradiction. Sovereignty has to exist somewhere, and sooner or later, the system's going to reveal that. There's going to be some crisis that shows where the buck ultimately stops.
It's interesting because the British system was the evolution, at least as I very roughly read British history, it's an evolution of how that power is distributed, right? So it's initially royal, then it becomes legislative, and then there's a battle through that. But there's not a lot of fighting over the power itself. I mean, the common law tradition provides some alternative disputes, but in the U.S., as you point out, I mean, this is really about how to diffuse that power in a way that doesn't make it dangerous, and that creates an entirely different set of dynamics in the U.S. case.
Yeah, the big question in 19th century Britain was about voting rights, extending the franchise, and the big Reform Act that comes along in 1832, and then right after the Civil War, many people observed that there was probably some connection there. And that Britain is much more democratic than the United States is. People
absolutely
today complain about the Electoral College and the U.S. Senate and all that. In Britain, it's one person, one vote, and has been since about World War I.
Although it's interesting, I was just at a conference recently where we were discussing Lord Salisbury and a lot of other folks who were that first generation that had to deal with those conservatives that had to deal with that wave of the expansion of the franchise and what that meant, not only for its politics but for its economics as well. Mm-hmm. But we're kind of going down a different little rabbit hole here. But I wanted to return to this question though of the institutional arrangements. Is it really the case that because one of the things that we talk about, I think you raised in your essay, is that sort of that cultural piece that Gompers points out, that's sociology, that societal piece, versus the institutional piece. Which one, in your mind, really helps to shape what happens in the U.S., where you get the National Labor Relations Board and you get this what I would say, that maybe I'm not using this term correctly, so correct me if I'm wrong, but a sort of entangled system. I mean, so that it seems to me that labor's position is entangled administratively in the executive and the judiciary, whereas in England it's quite different.
Yeah, right after World War II, when Britain essentially adopted, it was the Beveridge Plan, and it became socialist. The government simply took over steel and railroads and all that kind of stuff. At least until the Thatcher years. And in America, again, because of our different history and sort of aversion to socialist ideology, we end up with the mixed regime, sort of the regulatory state, which accomplishes many of the same ends as socialism, but does it through agencies like the Labor Board and the Federal Communications Commission and all these regulatory agencies. That's sort of one of I think you would call that a social result as well. Now, the people of Britain by the end of World War II were just more comfortable with overt socialism, whereas at least until very recently in the Democratic Party, that term was anathema in American politics, even though when you look at so much of our public sector, it's essentially socialism by any other name.
It seems to me, though, that is a function of the institutional arrangements, because when you've got diffuse power and you start to sort of create these little different centers, and then suddenly you get you sort of get a certain agreement among certain groups, and then you get administrators, you get bureaucrats who have this authority, and these boards that are unelected and I won't say completely unaccountable, because you said Congress could theoretically curtail them, but they emerge and they become power centers and they become very advantageous to the existing political class. And so it's a complicated mess. I mean, in some ways, your essay made me think a little bit more of this dicey argument that sovereignty in the parliament has some potential advantages over a more diffuse system.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of conservatives, libertarians today have pointed out that once the American system began to break down, you said that Madison's Constitution, the Founders' Constitution, was meant to prevent the administrative state. But then once it fails to do that, it has, as Francis Buckley says, no reverse gear. The system that was designed to prevent the creation of it then kind of locks it in and makes it very difficult to undo. I remember this most recently when people had regrets about Obamacare, and the Republicans were able to win control of the House of Representatives in the midterm elections in Obama's first term, but not the Senate, because we're only have a third of the Senate up for re-election. Well, people felt frustrated about that, but that was one of the institutional designs that was meant to prevent things from happening too precipitously. Which is why, if I don't want to be too sort of current eventish, but for all the talk right now about packing the Senate and the court and making these sort of permanent one-party institutional arrangements, now that the Democrats have won control of all three parts of the government, I wonder whether they'll do that. I mean, that's such a momentous thing, the unintended consequences of messing around with those sorts of fundamental institutional arrangements. I think people might have sober second thoughts about that.
Well, it was interesting. It's interesting you raise this, because to me, this discussion of court packing really seemed odd, particularly since it had failed once before.
Yeah.
And as you point out, the Congress has the ability to circumscribe the scope of the courts itself. So that power is undisputed and constitutional. And it always struck me as odd that, if the Democrats were in that kind of control of the legislature, and I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion about exactly how much control they really have over the legislature. I mean, the senior senator from West Virginia now runs the Senate.
Yeah.
As I was telling people the day after the Georgia elections, it's certainly good to be Joe. But how much power and authority they have sort of depends on that median senator. But in addition to that, why take on something much more controversial that runs contrary to established precedent rather than something that has been used more effectively? And that always struck me as very strange.
Right, and I think the other side of that equation too is Chief Justice Roberts has already shown signs of this, that the court follows the election returns. It historically has. It's rare moments like in 1937 where you had sort of such a lag between changes on the court and changes in the administration. FDR was the only president to go a full term without any vacancies on the court. There are interesting historical reasons why that occurred. I think that the court will behave itself and avoid any kind of confrontation with Congress.
So I wanted to turn before I forget. I wanted to turn to the topic you raised in the second half of your essay. I guess it's maybe the last third of your essay, and this is the question of race, because I had not sort of realized Dicey sort of played this role, or at least implicitly had played this role, or in this discussion. Can you describe for our viewers who maybe haven't had a chance to get to your essay yet, what impact this deviation from the rule of law, this establishment of this privilege, whether we call it rent seeking or whatever, and I think that, I guess my question is to first explain what happened, and then I've got a follow-up question that I'd like to ask you a little bit more directly on that. But can you explain how this topic, and I see you've got your assistant with you.
Yes.
That's super. So I don't know whether or not, that, is that your research assistant? Or?
Yeah, highly paid, yes.
Oh, I doubt. I'm sure you pay quite a bit, actually. I have a cat myself. But can you talk a little bit about exactly how race became part of that discussion? And then I want to ask you a sort of follow-up to that.
Yeah, this is my first, my dissertation, my first book was about the history of affirmative action, how it came to be. And I realized by the end of it that it really was sort of an outgrowth of the movement to empower labor unions. Affirmative action, as we call it today, the system of contractors, when you do business with the federal government, you have to have affirmative action plans. That had its origin in trying to force labor unions that were exclusively white to admit more blacks. So the history of racial preferences arose as a result of the system of union preferences because of the discriminatory history of American unions. And in the 19th century, the abolition movement, the anti-slavery movement, was also very hostile to organized labor because they sort of saw unions as sort of interfering in liberty of contract and the principles of free labor that they thought slavery violated. So many historians, sort of liberal historians, were sort of shocked that there was such a hostility to the cause of unionism on the part of the abolitionists. But it turns out to make perfect sense in an economic sense. And blacks benefited from the right to work, liberty of contract regime that the courts have protected in the 19th century. Often, for instance, if you had a labor dispute and white workers who excluded blacks went out on strike, blacks would enter those industries as strikebreakers. That's how they broke into the steel industry, especially after World War I. Coal mining, where there was competitive industry where, regardless of people's discriminatory tastes, the competition for labor was so fierce that blacks were able to enter that industry. So when the Wagner Act proposed to empower unions and give them the power to control the labor supply, the NAACP and the National Urban League opposed it because there was no provision in it for non-discrimination. The courts ended up inventing that labor union requirement in the 1940s during World War II, but it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act and the rise of affirmative action that you got serious enforcement of non-discrimination provisions. And a lot of that is due to the racial policies of American unions.
So my question is this: was the effect of creating this racial distinction, then this discrimination against African Americans being able to enter the labor market because of the labor privileges, was that a bug or a feature? Was the legislation designed for that reason implicitly, or was this? Go ahead.
Yeah, somewhat. Some precursor legislation of the Davis-Bacon Act is a great illustration of this, and it's still on the books. Where if you're doing a business for the federal government, especially for the building trades, as a government contractor, you have to pay the prevailing wage rate, which is essentially the union wage rate in a particular locality. And again, members of Congress were quite explicit about this, saying that during the Great Depression, this was a way of preventing blacks from leaving the South and going to northern cities where there were jobs for them. This would create effectively sort of a union wage rate so that employers would have no reason to try to use a more efficient or cheaper black labor. So the Davis-Bacon Act clearly had racial motivations behind it. The Wagner Act, I would say less so. Robert Wagner was sympathetic to the civil rights claims of blacks, but he simply told the NAACP, I can only fight one battle at a time. FDR was in exactly the same position. Dependent as they were on Southerners in Congress, especially the Senate, this would continue up until John F. Kennedy in the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yeah. And then, as you point out, LBJ becomes the ultimate. I wanted to one of the last questions I wanted to ask you. I wanted to read one of the last lines in your piece, which I think is really interesting. Is that race had always been the great exception to equality before the law, quote, the very centerpiece of Dicey's idea of the rule of law. I'm assuming that quote is from Judge's piece or from your piece?
Yes.
Okay. But rather than address that anomaly, the New Deal administrative state established a system of class-based policies that exacerbated it. The controversial system of race-based affirmative action arose largely in response to that first round of administrative state building and has been since expanded to a host of other groups, taking the United States ever further away from the ideas of equality before the law and rule of law. You know, the popular history is that the states were largely the problem, particularly the southern states, and then certain northern localities were the problem in establishing things like Jim Crow, and then the courts upheld it. And then also that it really took sort of the national government needed to solve this problem. But your argument here is that this system really evolves through the result of administrative law establishment, and that a movement towards a more equal form of rule of law could have prevented this earlier on. Elaborate on that point a little bit, because it certainly runs contrary to what we tend to think of in sort of commonplace discussions of these matters.
Yeah, well, one thing that the New Deal administrative state is doing was aimed at the South in particular, in that, and this goes back, for instance, to the World War I era controversy over child labor, where lower labor costs in the South were leading a lot of northern industries to relocate to southern states. I'm up here in Michigan, which was Grand Rapids, Michigan, was the furniture capital of America until child labor, lower labor costs in the Carolinas caused industry to move there. The New England textile industry did that as well. So New Deal legislation was meant to establish a kind of a floor or ceiling to prevent capital and labor from moving around the way that it does. But what it does then, for instance, not only by empowering unions, for example, did that benefit organizations that discriminated against blacks, but even if those unions took in black workers, they depressed overall employment in a way that harmed black Americans. It reduced their sort of opportunities in American industry, and it compelled employers to either relocate to other parts of the country or abroad. And black Americans are still sort of getting their foot in the door of the industrial workforce at a time that this legislation made industrial employment a lot more expensive. Again, which the racial element of that was perfectly fine for the insiders, for the white workers and employers in American industry. But that was another side effect of this, was not things that targeted black Americans in particular, but things that were preventing the workings of the market in a way that you would expect black Americans, like earlier immigrant groups, to be able to take advantage of.
To be able to benefit from, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's an interesting alternative history to not only the evolution of race and the evolution of the politics of race, but it's also a very interesting alternative history to how the administrative state plays a very powerful role in this. And Dicey's concept of rule of law as unfortunately being violated, and helped to create some of these privileges and these advantages, and one that I had not really considered prior to this. It's a fascinating alternative take.
That's one of the great things about the work that Judge is doing, is that historians don't pay any attention to this at all. And if they do address it, they get it wrong. I have relied a lot on economists and law professors and political scientists. So there is the story, the history of this really does need a lot of work.
No, it's a fascinating interdisciplinary story, and it's one that we need to learn more about and explore more about from a research perspective. So, well, Paul, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today, and thank you for introducing us to your research assistant. What is his or her name?
Her name is Dinah. Yeah,
Dinah. Well, Dinah, thank you for participating as well. You've got some views now, hopefully.
Yeah,
Thanks for a very, very interesting response essay and some great conversation. And I appreciate you taking the time to do this author interview for Liberty Matters.
Great pleasure. Hope to do it again sometime.
Thank you.